You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 438 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Chelsea Manning, Afghanistan, and the protests at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq. A lot of very important stuff to get to on today's show, so make sure you share it. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. The show, along with the daily news roundup that I write, are featured on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it. It's up pretty much everywhere people listen to podcasts. And if you want to donate to the show, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so I got a really important topic to talk about on today's show, and that is Chelsea Manning. Chelsea, unfortunately, is suffering in a jail cell right now, not being held on charges, but some grand jury nonsense. And I'm just going to try to do a very quick review of how we got here with Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning's position in the Army allows her access to a bunch of information, State Department cables, war logs from the Iraq and Afghan war. Chelsea Manning sees what's in here and then gives this information to Wikileaks. Wikileaks then publishes the information as a journalistic outfit, and Chelsea Manning is then turned in as the person who leaked that information by somebody I think she had met online. Manning was then investigated and arrested, charged with, disclosing classified information, and sentenced to 35 years in prison after a lengthy sentence. Also spent a whole lot of time just kind of sitting and waiting in solitary confinement. I think I read an article recently that said Chelsea Manning had spent 11% of the decade, between 2010 and 2020 in solitary confinement and 77% of that decade in prison. So, Chelsea is in a very unfortunate position in prison. This is also somebody who, when they leaked the documents, was actually Bradley Manning, a transgender person. And so just struggled, I guess, probably to transition to whatever extent that's even possible in a U.S. jail. And, kind of lived with being transgender in a male prison for quite some time. Eventually, granted clemency by Obama. And, I guess I give Obama just a little bit of credit for waiting till the very last minute to give Chelsea Manning some clemency. But, he could have fixed this in the very beginning by just pardoning Chelsea Manning, since, Chelsea just exposed to the American people the war crimes that George Bush was committing. Anyways, 2017 rolls around. I think it was May 2017 that Chelsea Manning gets out of prison. And, I think even floats running for Congress. Obviously, if you followed her Twitter account, it was a pretty turbulent time for her. I don't need to get too much into that, but just obviously this is somebody who is dealing with the effects of a very traumatic situation and a torturous situation that she was already put through with her prison sentence. Well, then 2018 rolls around, and the, Russiagate hysteria has gripped the nation. And so WikiLeaks, this group that was once, the ultimate enemy of the people. I remember, I'm growing up when Chelsea Manning puts out these leaks, and is then arrested. And I wasn't quite as politically in tune and informed as I am now. And I just remember listening in passing to, the right-wing commentators, Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, screaming about how, this is one of the most dangerous peoples and dangerous organizations. We're just trying to keep Americans safe, and they are putting Americans in danger, and really condemning, Chelsea and WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And, the reason Julian Assange ends up in the embassy in the UK in the first place is because of these kind of leaks that he had put out. So anyways, after the 2016 election and Julian Assange exposed the unbelievably corrupt, just Hillary Clinton and Clinton organization in general. And, the charity I'm sure is corrupt itself, but, I'm talking about quote unquote Clinton organization, Bill and Hillary Clinton, and the power that they wield and their influence peddling in Washington. Some of that gets exposed. And it's enough that, you know, Hillary Clinton's already an unlikable enough person that Donald Trump's actually able to beat her in the election. But the mass hysteria created by that, so it had to be the way that Hillary Clinton lost and the way that her supporters then keep her dignity is to make this ridiculous claim that Hillary Clinton only lost because Russia hacked her emails and gave those emails to Julian Assange. Now, there's they haven't presented proof. They can't prove that this is actually what happened, but that's their case. I mean, even if it was true, then they did us a service by exposing a corrupt politician in their country. I mean, just imagine if some American journalists did some hard-hitting journalism on, Vladimir Putin and dug up some documents about how he was very corrupt. And those documents helped, make Putin less powerful in Russia. Yeah, Putin and his supporters wouldn't like that, but we would see that as a heroic act, and the rest of the world would see it as, somebody doing the right thing and exposing corruption, which is good. But, that's the ridiculous standards that Russiagate has created in the U.S. So anyways, after 2 years of Russiagate, WikiLeaks have been sufficiently demonized by the left, and the right still really doesn't trust them, especially now that Trump's president. Just imagine if they start leaking how many, children are contracting different types of viruses and the, abysmal detention centers, the ICE detention centers, or exposes war crimes and drone strikes that Trump's carrying out that's killing civilians. I mean, there's probably a lot of good reporting and, just leaking the documents that need to be done around the war that Trump has been waging in Somalia, a record number of airstrikes in 2019 in Somalia, and nobody knows what the hell's going on there. A lot of times they don't even admit to airstrikes unless they're asked by the press. It's a fairly impoverished country at this point, sustaining, decades now of United States intervention. An extremely fractured country with like 4 pretty autonomous regions. One of those ruled by a group that the United States calls a terrorist organization, but they carry out airstrikes all over the place. There's mass bombings there. It's a really, terrible situation in Somalia that's not conducive to a whole bunch of journalists coming in. But man, just to get some reports from the Pentagon even about how many of these airstrikes are going on, and then if they have ideas on who they're killing at all, other than, we just blew up some military-aged males, so we'll count them all as al-Shabaab militants. So, there's a real fear from Republicans, I think, that WikiLeaks could do this and could really ruin the Trump administration, and tarnish their legacy, much like Chelsea Manning did with Bush and other whistleblowers too. You gotta give John Kiriakou a lot of credit in that. So, there's no political motivation for anybody to care about WikiLeaks or Chelsea Manning at this point. So in 2018, when Julian Assange is removed from the Ecuadorian prison, and the U.S. reveals their indictments against them, they demand that Chelsea Manning come testify at those indictments. She refuses to answer their questions, basically feeling like this was a setup for her. She couldn't have defense representation there or anything like that. This was testimony at a grand jury, not any kind of understandable courtroom. It's not the situation where the defense has their lawyer and the other side has their lawyer and everybody gets to make statements and you could confer with your defense to make sure you're only saying the things that you want to say. You don't want to phrase anything wrong, get somebody else or yourself in trouble, say something different than how you said it before, get things in the wrong order, and then suddenly you've perjured yourself or something like that. So that's not what the grand jury is. That's not the kind of court system that Chelsea Manning's in. So, they were refusing to participate in it. And, rather than just kind of shrugging their shoulders, realizing that, the First Amendment protects, free speech, that includes silence. And you have the Fifth Amendment, which means you don't have to testify. And just, basic human rights that says that, if you've already been investigated and cleared or, convicted of a crime and then granted clemency for it, you don't have to come back and testify for that. You've already done it. Well, no, the U.S. government decided to throw Chelsea Manning in jail in part of the time in solitary confinement. That grand jury then expired in about April of 2019, and a new one was impaneled, and Chelsea Manning was again arrested and thrown into jail. I think, again, spent some time in solitary confinement, very, restrictive conditions, and not in like the kind of club fed jail that you sometimes hear about that actually doesn't sound like the worst place in the world to be. This sounds like one of those jails that's the worst place in the world to be. So that's where Chelsea Manning has been for about the past 9 months. Again, I think this was April 2019 that this particular grand jury has imprisoned her for. And as long as she refuses to testify, they're going to hold her there. They're also fining her, I believe now, $1,000 a day for every day that she doesn't testify. She's already racked up $100,000 or so worth of fines. I mean, this is just the height of injustice. This is, I feel like, the kind of thing that, the Democrats feared would happen when Trump came to office, that he would round up transgendered people and throw them in cages without charges. Well, that's actually happened in this situation. I get there are some other details, but that has actually happened. That's, what Chelsea Manning is facing. That's the world that Chelsea Manning lives in, and that nobody cares. It's sad. I guess sometimes I don't know where to go. I get to this point where I'm talking to you, and what's happening is just so strange and unbelievable, and that nobody actually cares about it. I have trouble finding actual words to put to it. But that's the situation that I think, I see Chelsea Manning in right now. Now, apparently grand juries only last for 18 months. So once this grand jury is no longer impaneled, then I guess Chelsea would be released. I'm not sure if, maybe they could put together another grand jury or find some way to extend it so they don't have to release her from prison. Or maybe, if she's going to be able to get out and it takes a week, for whatever procedural reasons for that court to panel another grand jury, maybe, Chelsea could go live somewhere else for a couple of years, rather than being in jail. But, I don't know if that's what she wants to do, but, a very heroic fight that she has going on right now, refusing to cooperate with the grand jury system, not only to make a statement on the importance of WikiLeaks and, standing up for what's right, but also to battle the grand jury system. And this isn't something that I know a lot about, but I have been reading about it some around the Chelsea Manning issue. It's really an oppressive court system that allows prosecutors to, abuse potential witnesses and gain a lot of leverage on potentially innocent defendants with this unfair court system. So, I think, if we're looking at 2019 or 2020 and goals here, one would have to be to rally some kind of support to Chelsea Manning. Unfortunately, the only candidate that I see has remotely the courage to talk about this is Tulsi Gabbard. Now, remember that this is a person that was granted clemency by Barack Obama. So certainly you would think that this is has to be a pretty acceptable person, to be granted clemency by Barack Obama. But, I guess the war state is very powerful, and, obviously somebody who had exposed the crimes of the U.S. war and made the American appetite and bloodlust in the Middle East just a little bit less by showing them and holding up a mirror to it of how awful this thing is an enemy of, the war state and stuff. And so then if you're, any kind of respectable candidate who's going to get respectable money, you're probably not going to be too vocal on this issue. But again, Tulsi Gabbard has been and should get a lot of credit for that. I haven't heard Bernie say anything. That doesn't mean he's not better on this issue than somebody like Joe Biden. All right, so that's what I have on Chelsea, and I know I spent probably a little bit more time than I intended to on, but it's a very important story, and it is somebody that we need to find some way to help, because what's going on there is torture, as the UN Special Rapporteur on torture has released it in their report. Oh shoot, I have one note here that I didn't get to, and I just want to mention it. Apparently there's something called a grumble defense that says you can't hold somebody in jail because they are refusing to testify if their jail sentence clearly isn't going to be a motivating factor in getting them to testify, which sounds like a weird kind of backwards ass government thing to me. This was something I saw in the movie, The Report, about the U.S. torture program, where at one point they're saying that as long as whatever kind of interrogation, no matter how physical it gets, as long as you don't kill the person and you produce information, then what you do is okay. And so it kind of seems like that situation where you could torture someone, you could lock them in solitary confinement without charges, without reason, as long as you think that'll lead them to testify. However, there's something called a grumble defense, and I don't understand how all this works. I'm not a lawyer or anything, But apparently this has in the past been used to get people out of jail for saying that it doesn't matter. It's not going to coerce me. And so for that reason, apparently it's just a punishment and then unconstitutional or something. It seems like an unbelievably stupid nuance and distinction whether you could do it if it's going to coerce the person to testify or not. However, hopefully it's something that Chelsea could use to get out. So far it's been rejected by the judge though. Even though it's been upheld in other cases, the judge says no. And that's because, these judges and especially the DC area are apparently just awful, and the court systems there are just awful. And it's all about exerting American empire power and suppressing the people who stand against it. All right, now on to a very important story about this app that I've never used before, TikTok. Now, it's actually not that important of a story, but the Army has determined that the app is a national security risk because it's Chinese made, and I guess a lot of people in the Army were using it. So now if you're in the Army or Department of Defense, you cannot use this app. I'm not sure what will happen to you if you do. You guys probably, if you're in the Department of Defense, have an idea of what kind of demerits they would give you or something like that. I highly doubt it's a big deal, but at the same time, maybe it does get you in a little bit of trouble. It seems kind of like a silly policy. The Army did say, and this seems like some good news to me, is that they were using the app to effectively communicate with Generation Z, but now they can no longer do that. So too bad. Sorry for you to recruit in high schools. That kind of sucks. All right. In more serious news, Kim Jong-un announced that North Korea was no longer abiding by its self-imposed moratorium on tests of its nuclear program. What the self-imposed moratorium that Kim Jong-un is talking about, that's the freeze-for-freeze agreement that's been this non-official status between the U.S. and North Korea since the spring of 2018, after the Olympic Games and progress started to be made diplomatically between the two countries. Now, the U.S. really never fully abided by the freeze-for-freeze agreement. They still carried out war games, and while oftentimes they said, oh, they're defensive in nature and stuff like that, the reality was the opposite, that these war games were either simulating the invasion of North Korea, the capture of a high-value facility, or even at one point they were simulating war games of what they would do in North Korea 90 days after a successful invasion. And so these are all obviously aggressive war games. And in the eyes of North Korea, and I think kind of the incorrect interpretation of this, is that this is America's hostile policy towards North Korea. North Korea has long said that, America needs to reverse its hostile policy and get rid of the hostile policy. And so, North Korea stopped testing weapons. The United States did tone down and dial back, stop some war games, but there was still a lot going on. The U.S., continued a military buildup in the region and gave South Korea and Japan a lot of weapons. And so, it wasn't like the U.S. was really abiding by this agreement the whole time. Now, starting after the DMZ meeting, Kim Jong-un started to test some weapons, but they weren't necessarily subject to the freeze-for-freeze agreement. So in some ways, it was definitely violating the spirit, just like, maybe South Korea importing 20 F-35s, but, it wasn't maybe a letter of the unofficial agreement, violation. And that's the way I think both sides kind of interpreted those weapons tests. So Kim Jong-un announced that North Korea was no longer going to abide by that self-imposed moratorium. However, they didn't actually carry out any kind of weapons test or nuclear test. So they haven't actually broken that moratorium yet. North Korea kind of said that, look, they understand now that the Americans aren't prepared to abandon their hostile policy, the sanctions regime. Tim Chirac, I think, has done a great job to describe this as like a low intensity war that the U.S. has been waging against North Korea under the Trump administration, that the U.S. isn't going to give that up. So North Korea is going to find ways to live with that, but they're not going to try to, limit their program or give up their nuclear deterrent. So unfortunately, it really looks like Trump, missed that potential with North Korea to get something done. But I'll talk more about it next week, and not all hope is lost, but it's looking bleaker now, and North Korea kind of resigned to not getting a deal done, at least not with Trump. In other news, Gold Star families are suing several defense contractors. The lawsuit they have, and Gold Star families are families of fallen vets, are claiming that the contractors funded the Taliban gave them protection money and stuff like that, as, to not fight the Taliban. But the consequence of this was a stronger Taliban, and then Americans got killed. Danny Surgeon wrote a really good article on this at antiwar.com that I will link to in the show notes page. I suggest all of you go read that article. But in there, he talks a lot about the insurgency and just how ridiculous the whole war in Afghanistan is, and how this lawsuit really shows that. In Israel, Netanyahu is seeking immunity from parliament against the corruption charges he's facing. From my understanding, that these corruption charges are somewhat serious and pretty true, and so Netanyahu is in some risk of going to jail. As prime minister, his special request from parliament for immunity, he will need just a majority vote, and so it seems possible that he could overcome that hurdle. I know he can't get a majority vote to actually become prime minister, but if he could get some extra sympathy from maybe right-wing parties who aren't necessarily comfortable with him being prime minister, but that may vote for him to stay out of jail or something like that. I could see him making that threshold, I guess. It didn't seem like he was that far off, but I don't know that much about Israeli politics. It does seem like quite a low bar to me. If you're going to be a corrupt politician somewhere, Israel seems like a nice place to start. Not only do you get billions of American dollars a year, so just like Afghanistan, Iraq, or Ukraine, where you could just run away with this money and make a killing off of it. At least, in Israel, you also have a pretty low bar for being given clemency or immunity from that. So maybe Netanyahu ends up getting that and then going on to becoming prime minister. Israel's a couple of months away now from their third election in the past year. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that just over 11,000 Syrians were killed in 2019. This is the lowest total since the start of the war. So in that way, it's a good thing. At the same time, 35,000 civilians died in Syria in 2019, which is absolutely horrific. And, that war needs to end. It needs to get wrapped up. And the U.S. is just prolonging it. And, even if it was true and we were just there for the oil and that was the only goal, I mean, that would just be disgusting, corrupt greed that's leading to more and more people in Syria being killed unnecessarily. So the last episode of the show I recorded it on New Year's Day, and I talked quite a bit about the protests that had happened on New Year's Eve at the Baghdad and Iraq. So if you're interested in that, check it out there. Those protests resumed on New Year's Day and then came to an end. Now, the most interesting thing about this to me was the reporting all over the mainstream media. They reported that Iraqi militias were outside of the U.S. embassy. And as I pointed out on the show, and as I saw again in footage, it did seem like some of the people outside of those protests were wearing fatigues, but none of them were armed. And there were a lot of other people out there in street civilian clothing. So to just chalk it up as a bunch of protesters, militia, militants, was absolutely absurd and a misrepresentation of what was going on. I will say, though, those protests did subside once the leadership of the Popular Mobilization Forces said for the protests to end. It was getting to a fairly dangerous situation where, you have Americans now saying that they'll meet like a buzzsaw or a bone saw if they try to get into the embassy again, basically saying they're willing to slaughter civilians to hold on, to Iraqi territory that we stole, killing a million of them in 2003. Also really says something, doesn't it, that the U.S., has waged this 15 or so year long war now in Iraq. We, quote unquote, liberated them, built them a government and army, and now they're telling us to get the hell out of town. And it just seems like if that's the case, it should be a pretty clear indication that this was a foreign policy failure and that we should just listen to the people after all this time and leave. The U.S. has deployed quite a few forces to the Middle East in response. 100, I believe, Marines were actually sent to the embassy itself. 750 paratroopers were also deployed to the region, and now Trump is looking at sending another 4,000. More disturbingly than those troops going to the Middle East, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper says he sees signs that Iran or Iranian proxy forces are planning more attacks against, Iraqi bases housing U.S. forces, and that the U.S. would take preemptive action to prevent one of these attacks. So this seems quite dangerous, and basically the start of a new military operation in Iraq, where we're now fighting against the Shia side that we just supported and just helped take back from the Sunni Islamic State. All right, well, that's where I'm going to send it into the weekend. Hope everybody's enjoying the show. Make sure you share it. Find it online at the Libertarian Institute. Check out the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, and the Twitter account at KYAAALE. Donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.